All right, good morning, everybody. Kyle Haas here again with Mike Meyer. We're doing our Friday mornings at MMI over a cup of coffee. I've just re-upped mine, so I'm in for a good long conversation. How about you?
Um, I'm gonna need a warm up soon, but that's okay. We can work through this.
We'll make it work, right?
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
All right. Well, this morning, from what I understand, you want to dig into the Mod 1 a little bit. Some of the origins and some of the history behind all of the development that has gone into Mod 1. And I guess start for me by describing what Mod 1 is to people who don't know you, don't know the product lineup, don't know what that phrase means or where that came from.
So yeah, the Mod 1 suspension, it was basically kind of like we named it. We named like a series of parts that we kind of developed together. We I named this series of parts kind of this thought and process of parts the Mod 1 kit originally. And the Mod 1 kit was intended to make your car as good as it can be without cutting it up, without cutting shock towers out, without putting a 4 link in their back or a 3 link in the back. How good can we make this without reinventing like the entire ethos of the bottom of the car?
Mhm.
So in back in the day, in certain like autocrossing and road racing, they had classes that would say you cannot run a coilover. You cannot go to coilovers in the back. You have to keep your leaf spring. And so we had to really make the most of what we had. And we did really good. We really got a lot of success with that, from ride quality for street driving to track days and vintage cars. And it was like all these different customers that were constrained by the rules in the era at the time, and also people that just didn't want to cut their cars up, because back in the day, cutting your car up wasn't as big of a thing as it is today. Um, and so um, this refined bolt-on suspension ultimately became called the Mod 1 suspension, and it's for the guy that wants to bolt a really nice system on their car, something with a lot of thought behind it, a lot of regard to the details, but it's still his dad's car. It's still a member of the family, and they don't want to change the car to an extreme amount. Does that make sense?
Totally.
Um, and so, different strokes for different folks, right? And so this suspension became kind of our workhorse of all the suspensions. And it's our leaf springs. It turned into our coilover front, our coil shock replacement to our coilover, the lower control arm. So whenever you say Mod 1 to us at the shop, we're saying, okay, this person's bolting things on. That's really what it is. I mean, light fabrication, a little bit of MIG welding, nothing that where you're gonna permanently deface the car forever. It's not, you know. So so if you say Mod 1, that's what that is. And that's what we started our business around, was that concept. And then we slowly grew into developing beyond that, having more, more questions, more horizons to crest. And then the Mod 2 came about. And the Mod 2 was, okay, we've maxed out the parameters of our car with everything we can that we know at this time. And so we're going to get rid of the leaf springs. We're going to go coilover. We're going to get rid of some of the shock tower stuff going on. Still have some shock towers, but we're going to make proper control arm mounts. We're going to do everything we can to make this car as bad as possible without cutting the whole floor out of the car. So the Mod 2 came about once we kind of reached maximum fabrication levels, if you will, of Mod 1. And then as years went on, people started mixing things. They'd put a Mod 2 in the back and a Mod 1 in the front. Or some people would do a Mod 2 in the front and put a Mod 1 in the back. was their combo. And then people would do a mod 2 rear and mod 2 front, like you. And excuse me. And so then you and I started talking about that, and we're like, well, what do we do with that? I mean, so customers are calling up, I want a mod 2 rear, mod 1 front, blah, blah, blah. And then we we're getting more and more confused. So we started saying, okay, well, let's keep mod 1 the concept of we're bolting it on for the most part. There is light fabrication, but it's nothing really more than regular garage guy stuff. And then, and so mod 2 is definitely this other thought process, this next level thought process. And then, so we started naming, like, what's a mod 2 rear with a mod 1 front? Well, it's kind of a mix up. So let's call it a corkscrew, and we have our own, we can talk about names another time for kits or packages, I should say. And then, we haven't come up with a package name for a mod 2 front, mod 1 rear. We got to come up with that, because there are people that buy those, guys that want coyotes that are still cruisers, and they don't care to have the full coil over everything in the back.
Mhm.
And then you got the full mod 1 front back, we called the blacktop. It's kind of a fun deal finding those names. And then we had the apex, which was, what you have, which is the maximum. Like, we're going to go and we want to do as much as we can with what we have.
Mhm.
And that's the apex. But coming back to the blacktop, I was thinking about this the other day. The blacktop is a full mod 1 front, full mod 1 rear.
Mhm.
And I started thinking about, like, dude, there's a lot that went into the blacktop. It's probably the most developed package, even though just globally beyond Mike Meyer, I'd say the blacktop's the most developed package. And for the bang for the buck, it's a tremendous system. And I don't think people really knew how far back its roots go.
Mm.
And growing up as, in the Ford business, we had these Boss 302 books laying around in cases. We had cases and cases of these books that Ford put out. They had two books, a Boss 302 chassis modifications book and a Boss 302 engine modifications book. And I just remember up in the rafters, literally cases and cases of these books. My dad would sell them for like $5 a book or something like that. And the books were blueprints for the end user to modify their Mustang. So if you want to know how to do a valve job on your Mustang, you can go to the Boss 2 engine modifications book, and it taught you about a multi-angle valve job. If you wanted to put different camshafts in there, they gave you heights, they gave you durations, they gave you all the parts list that you needed to get the proper cam, lifters, rockers, all that stuff to work with your car. They gave you so much information. I'm looking back at the stuff going, honestly, it was a tremendous amount of work that Ford put in to these two books. If you kind of look behind just the words, the simple words, how did they come up with all these different camshaft combinations? How did they come up with all this stuff? Someone did it, and the chassis modifications book that they had, ultimately is what my dad built off of, all of his product line. And then now I've built off of that. So really, the grandfather of our blacktop is the Boss 302 chassis modifications book. And if you break it down, you have aftermarket front coils, aftermarket front shocks, aftermarket sway bar. Our Mod 1 has a coilover kit with updated, really nice shocks. And at the time, the Boss 302 had the double adjustable conies or the singles. That was the hottest shock you could buy at the time. Actually, the Monroe, believe it or not, was super hot. It was one of the first monotube shocks. So it was either the Monroe or the Coney. And then you had the sway bar combinations. You had up increased rear rate leafs. They had traction bar setups. They had patterns for you could trace out and create patterns for making shock tower brace brackets to weld to the front of your shock tower brace. They had patterns and dimensions for how to build your own roll cage, like lengths of tubing and angles and bend dimensions. They had a lot of people know the shock tower reinforcement stuff from the Boss 302s, where they talk about gusseting inside of the shock towers from the trailing part of the upper arm pulling through the shock tower. There was so much really rad tech in there that literally the entire industry just worked on and worked on. And so our stuff, if you look at the product, front suspension and our front suspension, we have a really updated version of that lower control arm they did. They had like a stock arm with some cool ball joints. We're still working with cool ball joints, but we have an adjustable lower arm, right? They couldn't run the caster we run because they were running manual steering. So we grew beyond that, and we have these arms, but started from back then, right? They had a rear panther rod kit, just like we have today, but theirs ripped out of the floor all the time. It was an early version because I used to make those panther rod kits when I was a kid for my dad, and our panther rod kit today is a multi-generational development from that original panther rod kit. So there's so much that was created from that Boss 302 book and from those engineers that I don't think people realize that they worked on it forever to get these baseline figures. And my dad and all of his cronies worked on it for years. And then actually there was a gap. Like all these guys went away. Like a lot of guys retired. My dad had a massive reduction in the size of the business at the end of the 80s and early 90s. So all the old school dudes that knew what was up and knew it all, they kind of disappeared. So when I started in the early 90s, I was by myself and I didn't know any of that tech. I just knew these books were up there. And it was just old books. So I really didn't go look at it. I just knew they were everywhere. So it's like right in your face and you don't even know it's there. So then what ended up happening was I got a couple chances to start driving and helping people in their cars. And we were going through all these different coils and we were going through all these different shock combinations. And we were going through all sorts of different ride heights, super low, super high, big sway bars, small sway bars, big springs, small springs. I mean, just all over the map. And I remember seeing all these old rear sway bars. So I made a bunch of different rear sway bars and was testing them. And I made different panther rod kits and did different bushings and leaf springs and just on and on and on and on. And then kind of got it dialed pretty good. The car was working pretty rad and we started finding these thresholds. And then you go back one day and you look at the Boss 302 book and you're like, I just really did that the hard way. But it was cool. I mean, I super learned a lot. And I definitely am the type of person that learns from putting my physical hands on it and doing it. Mm-hmm. So I don't think I would have learned any other way, but looking back at it, everything from brake kits to proportioning valves to it's all rooted there. And it's gotten us ultimately to here. And I don't think enough people know that.
Okay. All right, I'm going to give you a second to catch your breath there because there's a lot to digest and absorb. So I want to go back for a second and kind of sum up everything you've said so far. So at MMI, there are effectively so far 3 levels of gear, if you will, right? There's sort of 3 groupings. There's the MOD1, and the MOD2, right? And the idea with each of those is that they are, I hesitate to use the phrase steps of performance, but in a way that's kind of what they are. They all perform exceptionally.
I'd say they're 3 different places for people to find their home.
There you go.
Because someone who's looking for max performance for their vintage Trans Am car is gonna go to a mod kit because vintage TA is limited to a stock coil. I mean, stock style coil, a
Mhm,
stock style pickup point, right? They can't go to a mod one. So in that scenario, they're going max for their rule set.
mhm,
But that same suspension, amazingly enough, is wonderful for the person cruising to the coast.
mhm.
And so you don't want someone cruising to the coast with their big wood steering wheel in a Mod 2 complete.
So if anything, it's more of a, like you said, it's about finding your home, finding your purpose. The Mod 2 isn't going to fit for the guy who, is cruising to the winery on the weekend. It'll work, but it's not really what that's for, right?
Yeah.
So it's about
Yeah. You
finding
can
your purpose.
absolutely, I've absolutely gone on multi-hour drives in I mean, everybody, I think we've all done it in the Mod 2, but the intent for the Mod 2 is just to drive the living piss out of it, but enjoy driving it as you can, right? It's different case.
And I think that's an important distinction because it's really easy to just assume that the Mod 2 is the best. It's the most expensive, it's the most involved in terms of an install. I think it's really easy for a lot of consumers, us, to just assume that if it's the most expensive, it's the best you have to offer. But that's
Mhm.
not really the case, right? It's just a different use scenario.
Right, right. You don't want to give a guy a 10 speed if they're asking for a mountain bike,
Right. And
you
so
know.
we've got mod, which is effectively an improvement on what you would find in a stock setup on the car.
Hmm.
We've got mod one, which is what's sort of the best available uh, parts that we can bolt on to the car. And I don't mean bolt on in that, you hear that phrase, it's sort of a disparaging one, right? Oh, this guy's just bolting stuff on his car. It's not really what we're talking about here. What we're really talking about is the stuff that works when you don't want to cut up your car, is what I'm hearing.
Right, right. Yeah. It sounds funny. Like you'll find the people who buy mod ones um are generally family people, someone in the thick of kids coming up. I've got a job. I've got a life beyond my car, but I absolutely love my car. I absolutely daydream about it, but I only have so much bandwidth within me. And so when I get something for my car, I can't devote 6 months to one specific subject.
Hmm.
I have this other thing in my life called baseball practice or whatever you got going on. So you want to be able to get something like a coilover kit. And when it shows up, you could bolt it on in a weekend.
Hmm.
And it's not a tremendous time suck from your life. But when you bolted it on, this kit's what you had hoped for the last 4 months when it was being made, right? It was beautifully TIG welded. It's well regarded. It's assembled. The shocks are the best shocks we can buy for it. It's what you want for your car without having the investment of hacking your car up. Does that make sense, kind of?
Hmm. Completely. And that makes sense given the history, it sounds like. So what I'm hearing from you is that this Mod 1 development effectively started the day that some of these Mustangs rolled off the assembly line in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. There was a book that you found that more or less should have come with the cars back in the day that sort of spelled out what some of these changes look like.
Yeah, yeah. No, it was huge. You can still buy them online. I think even Branda sells them. But yeah, I mean, so the at the time, it was on the trailing edge. That era was on the trailing edge of people still did stuff in their garages. Like, and when I say stuff, it's not like they bought a tape measure and then measured something and then they borrowed their neighbor's saw and then they cut a piece of wood and that was their version of doing stuff. That's their version of stuff was um I I machined my own alternator pulley in my garage. you know
Mhm.
People still did stuff, like they still dropped the oil pan out the bottom of the car and rolled out the crank bearings and put new main cap bearings in.
Hmm.
That's the kind of stuff guys still did back in the day on a regular. Guys change oil pans, they would put camshafts in the garage, they would weld and fabricate brackets. I mean, I remember thankfully being a kid and going to my dad's friend's house, and he's got a Lincoln Ideal Arc in the garage. It took up a third of the parking spot. It was a huge TIG welder, and you turn it on and the neighborhood brown out. But it was still, guys did that stuff, and so since that was still in the ethos of those people, the the dealers tailored to that mindset. And so we know that we as a manufacturer can only put so much into these cars because we still need to make money.
Mm-hmm.
The development at that time was tremendously fast. Every 2 years, they reinvented the platform of the Mustang. So in 65.6, the car was a certain shape. You could fit a certain wheel tire size under there. You could, they had a certain front windshield angle, the front lead edge of the hood was so high. The rear windshield angle was such, and then in 67.8, the front windshield angle dropped, I think, like 2 degrees. The rear windshield angle slackened a bit. The lead edge of the hood dropped a teeny tiny bit. The wheel openings not only got bigger, like for width, but they got longer for a taller diameter tire. And then in 69.70, all that happened again. So the whole platform, and then also they started making lower control arms longer, gave better geometry. They started doing things like they were doing things like they'd get this car done and it would kind of be going for almost a year and they'd already have the new version coming out that they were manufacturing and developing. And then you look at the development from the Hyper 289 motor to the Boss 302. I mean, what a tremendous shift from a Hypo 289. Had these high compression little tiny heads, which are cool. But if you drive a true old school Hypo 289 with a Hypo cam and everything in it, it spun to 7,000 RPM. It got to 7,000 RPM eventually, but it was kind of a turd small little motor. I mean, but at the time it was legit.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Boss 302 comes out, 4-bolt main. You can spin that thing a solid lifter cam. You can spin the crap out of it. I mean, had huge ports, had a lot of really neat stuff. The shock towers were all beefed up. They went to staggered shocks in the back. There was so much neat stuff that kind of snuck in there for homologation rules.
Okay.
But the car still had to be street car. And then I don't know if I told you, but I got some notes from a customer years and years ago, and I kind of kicked myself because I don't know where they're at. But it was handwritten notes from the 1969 Trans Am series from the Ford factory Trans Am team. And it was all the different header changes they were making and the RPM in each turn of the test track. Okay, header set number 1, header set number 2, header set number 3. Okay, spring package 1, spring package 2, spring package 3. And then it was how many lateral G's they would pull and the times and corner by corner mile per hour and full data. I mean, like they had a ton of all the lateral G numbers, speeds, lap times. I mean, I had pages and pages and pages of all these notes that were phenomenal. And that wasn't even the year they won, right? They came back in 70 and won. And I think it was a gift. They were working their butt off, a ton of guys, but Donahue was in that transition year between Chevrolet and AMC. So he graced Ford with an opportunity there. But Ford nonetheless had a ton of development going. And they were testing, they were renting out tracks nonstop. They had data acquisition. They had Parnelli Jones, one of the best drivers of all time. George Fulmer was awesome himself. And and so they packaged this stuff up and wrote a book, a couple books of a lot of their development because they wanted people to buy these cars and then have a furthered avenue to kick the snot out of the Camaro guys' butts to further their footprint of a dominant supplier or manufacturer Ford. So it was like an all hands on deck. The guys in the office writing these tech manuals for people like us. I mean,
So really, the book then was a culmination of, hey, here's everything we've learned in building these things because we are, I mean, your A to B point from that 289 to that Boss motor is what, 4 years, 3 years?
yeah, right. It's really fast. My
And
my dad was running a Boss 302 in 1968 before the Boss 302s came out, and they sent him a Boss 302 in a crate, and it was just there's something at the airport. Go pick it up. He didn't even know he was getting a motor. He just knew that there was something at the airport, and it was a 68 Boss 302. So that really meant that the Boss 302 had to have been in development in 67,
Mhm. And so the the
67,
change
68.
was just so exceptionally quick. The cars were changing so quick. You had a racing team with a rather large budget to run all of these changes, take all of these notes, and this book, in a way, was sort of the culmination of all of these different disciplines coming together and contributing to here's how we give the guy who just bought a car off the lot a better chance at winning this weekend.
I mean, dude, honestly, kind of rad.
I mean, you don't see that anymore. And
No,
that's another part of the conversation I want to get into a little bit later is just how that's changed. I mean, you talked about how like patterns and cutouts. You don't see that anymore. So I want to come back and touch on that in a little bit. Um, but it sounds like then, so there were two books, right? There was an engine book and a suspension book. Is that what I'm hearing?
yep.
Okay. And so MOD1 then was a lot of the changes that were in that suspension book that your dad grabbed onto and evolved in his own way. And what were some of the things that he made improvements to during his tenure with it? What was like the earliest stages of MOD1? Do you remember?
Well, yeah, I mean, so my dad was, so there's different kinds of drivers out there. And so you get guys that are wheelmen, like just great drivers.
Mm-hmm.
Pops was a great driver, but he wasn't a setup guy. If the thing, if he had an opportunity to change springs and bars and do testing, it wasn't really the first thing on his mind. He'd probably be in there polishing the wheels. And um he would work on running, being at the gym and exercising so he could last the race. Whereas I kind of look at it like, yeah, I like to exercise, I like to run, but why was the car such a piece of shit to steer in the first place?
Mm-hmm.
Why did you have to be a Hulk to steer it? Well, back then there were kind of at that time there was a fracture of types of drivers. There was driver engineers developing, which were people like Smokey Unick. Well, Smokey wasn't really a driver. Um, you had Mark Donahue, who sat there and said, "Why does this car suck? Let's figure this out." And then you had Jim Hall. He was an engineer, and he really looked for the better place, the better way of doing things. Dan Gurney. They really pulled together this thought process of how do we make this car better.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas then there was the other guys who were the more so hobby guys that were driving more or less what they had. And I think my dad was that way because he was trying to grow his business. He was trying to bring these products, like, because at the time, I remember my dad telling me all the time, he says, I really want, you can't open up a magazine and buy anything. You could buy like a pair of carburetors. You could buy maybe some wheels or some tires, But if you wanted to flare your car, there were no options for that.
Mhm.
If you wanted a different kind of hood on your car, there's no options for that. And so Pops, his goal was really bringing options to the people.
Mhm.
So you can build your dream. So if you want to do this hood, those flares with this camshaft, he wanted to promote you in growing through that.
Okay.
And so Pops was so busy doing that, that was truly his focus. So when he did race, it was him driving, and then during the weekday trying to bring this concept to life, which wasn't a thing. So when it came to developing suspension, he wasn't there. He was more, it was, I think we become so climatized at how easy it is to buy stuff today. Well, today is shifting compared to 10 years ago, but you could just buy things now. Whereas back then you didn't even have the option to buy it. In the 60s, this was all, everybody made everything if you wanted anything.
Mhm.
And so Pops, his early stuff was good ball joints. His early stuff was good shocks, or he was reproducing the panel rod kits because you couldn't really you couldn't really find those panel rod kits anywhere. He would reproduce the traction bar kits. So he did all that kind of stuff, just bringing it to the people. Does that make sense?
Sure.
So that was a huge step unto itself. And then when I started there in the early 90s, he had just started realigning the ball joint angles for Shelby drops.
Hmm.
That was like a thing. Hey, if we cut the ball joint out of the arm, realign it, then we didn't bottom out the ball joint. And so that was a thing that was big. He was one of the first things I was welding up was like Monte Carlo bars. It goes across the engine compartment.
Mhm.
I would do those. He started making sway bars. He literally started reproducing the parts in the Boss Road 2 book. And then, but progressive development on new items wasn't so much a jam. He created the the subframe connectors.
Mhm.
That's a big one. I mean,
Mhm.
the subframe connectors were a really big deal because we still sell that generic design today. We modified it, but really, I mean, I think his big step was just bringing the fundamentals to the plate, and then we could build off of it.
Yeah, so you don't have to have the giant welder in your garage. Here are some of the parts that we've made that just make it better. And we're going to make that available to the guy working on the weekend plate on the weekend.
Yeah, well, you could still have to weld it because you needed to put it in the car,
Sure.
but the majority of it has been produced. We sourced the bushings, we made the traction bar arm itself, we put bushings in it.
Uh-huh.
You didn't have to do all that, but you still had to weld it in your car,
Sure. So
right?
that's if that's generation 1 or 1.5, you get your hands on it and you start doing iterative development. So what does that look like? What did it start with? Where did you take it first?
Well, we had a couple of vintage Trans Am customers, and they just got into road racing.
Mhm.
So quite literally, they were really green. And if it was a fun weekend, like we drank beer, we barbecued, and the car made it through the whole weekend, it was pretty rad. That was like the early goal. And they had come to us because we had been an old name, but by this time all the people had left.
Mhm.
It was Pops, me, and like two other guys. And ended up what ended up happening was I started noticing things like the tires were wearing funny on the car, but it was just early in my career, so I didn't really know what I was looking at either. I was a teenager.
Mhm.
Excuse me. And so, excuse me. So what ended up happening was, um, I kind of started seeing some weird things about the car, like our customer cars, and I started kind of searching, like, why is that doing that? And the customers didn't always know it was even happening.
Hmm.
And I wasn't driving the car, so I didn't know what they were feeling. And then eventually I got an opportunity to drive some super buckety 68 fastback. And it was a good friend of mine's car. He's like, hey, yeah, um, we can fix up my car. And I drove it around the block one day and it was freaking horrible, scary to drive. It was left and right and all over the place. And so he became one of my best buddies. And we ended up literally just rebuilding everything kind of stockish on the car, just so the thing drove straight and it
Sure.
didn't kill everybody. And then we used to have this series in the San Francisco Bay here called the Winter Slush Series for autocrossing. And then he and I ran regularly throughout the year, throughout the summer. And we had decided, why don't we run the 68 in the winter series? And it's just like Oakland Coliseum where the A's played. There's a local horse track here with a horrible surface. The old Giant Stadium, Candlestick Park. Just these really crappy sites that were around forever. So we're like, and they were local. We could just drive to it. We didn't have to tow. We didn't have to do all these things.
Uh-huh.
And so we started driving it. And of course, and we were running an E-Street prepared. You could change springs, shocks, bars, but you couldn't go coil. You couldn't go coilover. You couldn't go tubular. So I started going bananas. I started making all sorts of different rear leaf springs. I started doing all sorts of different coil springs. I put the car in the computer. I started plotting geometries out. I started sending shocks back. I was getting them all revalved over and over and over. Then I finally started getting shocks where I started modifying them so I could revalve them myself. And the car had this super weenie 302. I mean, I think that there was a section of the exhaust that was still original underneath underneath, and it was I thought I pushed silence. I guess not. And so what ended up happening was I had it just had no power. This thing was such a gutless pig, but we got it to where we just never had to lift.
Mm-hmm.
And we went through multiple iterations of panel rod kits, panel rod heights, tons of sway bar combinations, and we started winning with this thing. And the guys were running new like 2001 Camaros, 99 Camaros. Oh my God, hold on. I see fresh cup of coffee coming our way, dude. Hold on. This is a big deal. Hold on. Oh, as it comes in with a yawn. Hold on here. I'm sorry, everybody. This is an important moment. Hold on.
Da 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 da.
Oh man, you thought I was jacked up. I was eating the grounds on the bottom of this coffee,
uh,
and now I'm gonna try and get all jacked up on Mountain Dew here. All right, so that car actually became really rad, and it was there was a lot of beer, a lot of evenings, a lot of randomry going on, and it was funny because the car was pretty beat looking, but it really took great photos from like 50 feet.
okay.
And the steering was pretty sloppy. And just a little side tangent. That car got done, and that was the original old blue. That because it was a blue 68 fastback. Years later, um, the guy became our son's godfather that owned the car. And that car, I could kind of just say, hey, I'm gonna come get the car. I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna do that. And he's like, oh, okay, whatever. Because I ultimately did a bunch of work to the car, and I'd always do something to it every time I borrowed it. Well, Von Gettin Jr. calls up one day and he's like, hey, dude, I'm doing this 50 years of Ford video.
Mm-hmm.
And I need a 65 Mustang, I need a 68 Mustang, and I need a 73, and I need these other cars. So I was like, okay, I can get you three of the cars. I can get you a 71 to 3, I can get you a 68, and I can get you an R65. Because he wanted to do every generation of car.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, the 68 that's going to come down. It takes great photos. Don't be scared of it when you see it. You know, because we're going down to the Ford proving grounds in Arizona, right?
Uh,
And this is like a Ford thing. It's not like just some like we're shooting a video in our backyard. It's you're at the proving grounds and you had to get in and all this stuff. And
uh,
so we drop off the 68 in advance. We left it under like a lean-to. It was like really weird. We just left it there with the keys in the middle of Arizona, some big tarmac.
uh. Good luck. See you in a bit.
I remember telling him it was him and Chris Forsberg. And I said, hey, I never met Chris before. And he goes, I said, dude, trust me, man. This it's a bucket, but it's awesome. It's the Village bicycle. And this was had the coilover kit in the front. It was all the work we had done. It was the very first blacktop car, right? But it still had stock brakes, but they worked because we refined them and got them working.
Mhm.
Had the stock power steering still, but it was the fundamentals, the spring rates, the combos, all the stuff, right? Had a T5 with a crappy 302 in it. And I said, dude, but when you guys drive it, it's gonna be rad. And when you tell that to Von Gittin Jr. and Chris Forsberg, it's like I should have been a little quieter about that one. I get this text later on because I was racing somewhere else. Dude, this car is so dope. And they ended up doing the whole video, and they did a follow-up video behind the scenes of all the cars, and they picked that car as their favorite one. Here's old blue with the Roush motor in it. It's like freaking gnarly, and all these other cool cars. And they picked the Village bicycle, old blue. After all that work was their fun one. But that's where that came from. We did a ton of development, and then ever since then, we've been putting on. We've been just refining and refining and refining with every batch of product that we make towards the MOD1.
Mhm.
Whether it's in the steering system, whether it's in the shocks or the springs or the way we make the control arms, the leaf springs, the way we make the panda rod kits, it just keeps getting refined more so.
Okay.
And that's kind of where that came with that whole progression.
So let me ask you this then, because I'm kind of curious about it. If that was a line of thinking that started in the late 60s, right? And Mod 1 would become an evolution of that. We're talking 40, 50, 60 years. There was a lot of development that Ford was still doing on the Mustang as it was rolling off of the factory floor, right? They had
Oh yeah.
Mustang 2 front end. They had all these different sort of setups. Was that an evolution? Was that a branch of evolution? I mean, you continued this onto today. Did Ford do that, or did they get off on a certain, exit and start going a different direction? Where does your development line up with the development of all the other products and kits and solutions that are available today?
Well, where Ford went and why, I mean, I can only kind of guess on that one. It really seems like everything got shut down at the end of 1970.
Mhm.
The 71, the 73 platform. I was talking with a friend of mine this morning who was involved in chassis at Ford at that time, ultimately ran a large division of Ford with Jackie Stewart. And he was saying a lot of those guys that were in that era, the late 60s, early 70 program, they all went on to become executives and became really high end at SVO and big development. and but but that 71 to 73 was kind of opposed to what everybody thinks was like the peak of that platform. There was so much development in the 71 to 73 Mustangs, from aero to track width to control arm angles to steering improvements. There was a lot on that car that was really good that I don't think nearly enough people give credit to. And then the other one is when the 74 Mustang came out, you could pretty much see it, at least from our perspective, it seemed like the industry was castrated. You know, the engineers were hamstrung. There was a whole different angle. They'd spent the last 10 years with this total performance approach, which was just tremendous amounts of money being dumped into it. At some point, the bean counters had to stop, you know. But to their credit, they've been marketing that 1965 to 1967 era ever since. I mean, if you look at how much dollars bang for buck they've been getting from that, they're probably doing some high fives right now on all that work they did, because they sure stretched that marketing dollar out, you know. And but the Mustang 2, yeah, they kind of got into the rack and pinion. But I don't know if you've driven that specific rack and pinion. What a pile of garbage. I mean, but it was a rack and it was the right direction. So you can't really kick it in the shins because it was Rev 1. You know, I drove my dad's old 1980 Trans Am car. I drove it, had a Mustang 2 rack in it. And it was like steering a tugboat. You couldn't literally get it through a slalom. It was crazy. I couldn't believe my dad raced it like that. And so it was like I think they realigned their directions. The early Fox bodies were cool. I think there was a lot of development, but I that total performance, the engine modification book, the chassis modifications book, I could be wrong, but I don't ever remember seeing anything like that ever since. Solid lifter cams, big ports, the inline six Autolite carburetor combinations, the plenums. I mean, if you look at the shape of the Boss 302 head, that's basically the founding father to the Yates head. You know, I mean, those guys were so potent, and the stuff that they were giving us at that time, I still think that it's great when we have customers showing up at an autocross today. We've got this one kid who shows up. He's a college student, and he runs his little 66 coupe with a 250 horsepower motor, and he puts that bugger right mid pack with all the current cam cars, like current Mustangs, current Camaros, and he's got 225s. He unpacked his tent out of the trunk and he set it up at the airport because he's a college kid, and he's got his like 6-pack of beer and his little barbecue thing, and dude, he's laying it right in the thick of it with all these gnarly cars 50 years later, and that information, and he put it on. I mean, he built the car by the time between 15 and 20 years old. And a lot of that fundamental stuff has grown, and to be able to cut a car to act like that. And then, I mean, and this is kind of neat too. My son has been getting a chance to drive a bunch of cars, and like all these neat pro touring cars, and he's really gotten a great opportunity to drive a lot of really, really nice cars. And so he's 19, and I don't really think yet he understands how many rad combos he's gotten to experience. And I was asking him the other day, I said, dude, like, so what's probably your favorite car? You've driven this tube chassis car, you've driven this original Cobra, you've driven Old Blue, you've driven Frank Stagnero's car. I mean, you've driven tons of different things. Mike Ansell's Corvette. I mean, there's a lot of cars he's driven. New Corvettes and pro touring trucks, and he goes, I think I like David's Mustang. And I totally wasn't even thinking of that car, because I was thinking of all these big high-end, big dollar pro touring cars. And I like the record scratch. And I was like, David's car? And he goes, yeah. He goes, Dad, you step on the brakes are right there. He goes, the feel's right, the pressure's right. I turn the wheel, the car turns, it rips through a slalom. It kind of does everything. He goes, sure, we're not like the fastest because we've got a stock 302, a top loader, and 225s. He's like, but then we just throw the stuff in the trunk and we go home. We just cruise it home. He's like, and the car ripped. It had the best mannerisms. It had the best balance out of all of them. It just didn't have 335s and a 450 or 500 horsepower motor and all this stuff. He goes, but that car is the funnest car. And that goes back to what Bon Gittin was saying was that car was just fun, and I was just thinking about this coming full circle, like, the blacktop kit today has this rooted history that I don't think's talked about enough. I don't think it's really quantified. I mean, there's so much cool stuff that was done back then that we don't even know we're surfing on the wave of. Does that make sense?
Mhm. And I think what's interesting about it too is it's the natural evolution of a setup that was designed for that platform. So often today you see other suspension manufacturers and packages trying to one size fits all. Hey, this we like this spindle, so we're going to make it work on this car. We like this setup on a Corvette or whatever that may be. We're going to try and reverse engineer that and put that on this platform, right? There's a lot of mixing and matching from other platforms and other setups. I like that this one is a natural evolution of what worked for it back in the day. It's just been improved upon, built upon, and just made better over all this time.
So what car does that that's not a Mustang?
What car has been around that consecutively?
There, there is one.
Hmm.
There is one. Hmm. There's a Porsche.
Oh, mhm.
They've been doing the same thing over and over and over, kicking the same dog. And that car is the most winning car manufacturer in Le Mans history. It's one of the most winning car, and they just keep refining. I mean, it's sure it's not the same car today, but it's the same concept, right?
Mhm.
You look at how long they've been doing the same thing over and over and over and over. And you look at Frank Stagnero's car. He's kept that car since 1969, and he just keeps going through it. I just got a picture yesterday of a new set of cylinder heads again. I mean, like some of the greatest cars I've driven are the ones that you stick with
Mhm.
and you fix the problems at hand, and then you drive it and enjoy it, and then the next challenge at hand, and then that kind of becomes fun.
Mhm.
That becomes like kind of the thing. I was sitting there last night looking at Old Blue at it was like 8:30. We just sat down. I opened up a beer and I was like just looking at it. And my son's sitting in the driver's seat and we're fitting him up with a new steering wheel. I'm trying to get the steering compartment just a little better. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, check those brakes out. Check that upper control arm out. Check that out. Look at that over there. And it was just kind of cool. It was just kind of fun. It's like your stuff. You just keep making it better. And I think that that's what's really cool about the blacktop is sure it's the same, but it's not. But it's the same, but it's not.
Mhm.
To your point, it's just this progression.
Hmm. That's super cool. I next time I think I want to get into because you did talk a little bit about how people used to be able to modify these cards and work on these cards, and there is some of that still alive today. But I think a really interesting topic for us would be how has that changed over the years, and what it's been like modifying, say, old blue versus new blue. Something from '65 versus something from 2017, and just the challenges associated with that. I think that would be
That
a fun
that
conversation.
that would be a good one. I'm actually glad you brought that up because that one messed with my head. ah,
All right, well, maybe that'll be our next Friday at MMI. So we've been on for almost an hour now, talking about the Mod 1 and the history and the development of it.
yeah.
Certainly a history lesson for me. It's
Go,
amazing to see that a
go
lot
get
of
a
that is alive.
go for your Christmas Christmas stocking stuffer or for a birthday gift, ask for both of those books.
Okay.
Look them up before they're gone. Get the Boss 302 Chassis Modifications book and Boss 302 Engine Modifications book. My wife just told me through the back of my ear here that Tony Branda still sells it. And get the books. I mean, legit read through it. You'll see some stuff that's ridiculous. Like I know we got to go, but I've got this old catalog from my dad's shop. And actually, remember I was talking about that car I drove the last one where I stepped on the brakes. There were no brakes in the car.
Uh-huh.
That's the car. And so it's kind of crazy. Chuck's a rad dude. He's such a good guy.
Is that the 84 catalog?
That's 1984.
There you go.
And that's the car that had the Pinto rack in it.
Okay.
The Mustang 2 rack. It
Sure.
was a really cool car. But if you look through this book here, let's see here. My dad, I think, legit lifted some of this stuff way back in the day. You start looking at a lot of these, like all this stuff in here for like clutches and pistons and stuff. And you're looking through it, and it has these things. It has the size, the quantity, and the weight for every single item. I mean, literally for intake gasket kits, weight. So you could sit there and plan out how much weight you're putting in and out of your car. I mean, kind of rad stuff. So, I mean, there's so much tech in there that if you get that book, if you go through and get them, the Boss 2 versions, you'll have some fun reading. It's good stuff.
Well, it sounds like not only a history lesson, but a walk through sort of how to make your car better. Like you said, skip the hard part, skip trying 40 different header combinations, and just start with what's in the book.
Yeah, dude. Dude, honestly, people say it's antiquated. It is absolutely not antiquated. There's a lot of good stuff there.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, Mike, thank you again for the time this morning. This has been really interesting and kind of an awesome thing. It's good to know that there's still a lot of good information at the library tucked away in some of these old books that these old guys put together.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, Kyle, and I appreciate being here and talking with everybody.
Sure thing. All right, you guys. As always, if you have any comments or questions or topics you'd like us to talk about, please drop them in the notes below, or shoot me an email. You'll find my email address on our website. Yeah, thank you so much. We look forward to seeing you again with Mike at a future coffee on a Friday morning. Cheers.
All right. See you guys.
Thanks, guys.